Understand, we will discuss that.
You can change the subject. You can take a book or a piece of paper, newspaper or something in you that
just go in
your
and
mind
watch
goes
the video.
Let's go back to Rabbi Yonah.
Yeah.
You remember he said, if I would have asked for 2 miles, but in what Shalom he wants to say, he wants to say this: a person should not to speak with the same mouth that he says the words of Torah, words that are completely non-spiritual words, materialistic. We're not talking about Shabbos. We're talking about our holy sages' work.
We have to. I've got to explain. He's caught here. What it's trying to say here is not that it's a law that you must not use your mouth to talk about other things during the week, that you use the same mouth to learn and speak words of Torah. It's not saying that. You should have in mind to guard that it's using words of Torah, that you should have a bridle on it to keep it closed when it's talking about just everyday.
This is something you have to aspire. Rav Shalom wants to say, Torah, you should not speak with a mouth the words of Torah, and then the Gorim Shalom, things that are just worship, because our holy sages, they made themselves kikili shores, like holy vessels that were doing the avodah, that they did not use these holy vessels, that they became anything that was less than.
That we learn here that there were individuals in the past who worked themselves over in such a way that they considered themselves as if they were a utensil used in the worship, and therefore, like any vessel could not be used for anything else except for holy work. They kept themselves in control, that they didn't let words come out of their mouth, not of a holy or Torah. They made themselves like a vessel, like a holy vessel, which could not, if somebody took it out and used it for something else.
I'm reading the Gemara, and this is what we say in the Gemara, the Bnei Ma'arova, the men of the West, the men of Israel, any kind of bad, bar ripopote, v'araisa tov, good Torah. Yesh shegorsim, there are others that want to go and learn another version of this thing. The word karve is, as he translated, as plowing. Actually, karve is not exactly what you do to a plant after it's growing. You call them hoeing. It's a light type of plowing. All this activity is bad. Only in the area of hoeing in the Torah is it good. Oh yeah. Lomar, shovels. All the thoughts, all the words and the thoughts, that a person thinks about them in this world, everything is vanity, and it is of content, except the thoughts of Torah and the actions of God, that this is awe-inspiring. So it doesn't mean that everybody gets it.
It's not a job where you can clean up and go about your business and get your paycheck and that's it, and you don't have to talk or make anything. Yeah. But it's a job where you're in public relations, you have to talk.
Right.
It's your job. How do you go about just talking so you can fulfill this?
Let's talk now. Let's talk practical. I practice law to make a living. At any rate, I go to court and I speak to the judge, and I have to go and advocate my client's position. I always make it a business to speak as few words as possible. I say as few words as possible. I just say just enough to get the concept of what I want to get across to the judge. I don't say any extra words. I went to traffic court several times for him. Actually, not several times. But I always speak very few words. The important thing is that I win for it. But I speak as few words as possible. Now that is the art of not trying to say anything more than absolutely necessary. Remember, we had the first phrase that Shimon, as all my days I have gone among the sages, and I didn't find anything more better for the body than silence. And then he says the second phrase, that learning is not the most important thing, but doing, the action.
Yeah.
So he says like this, what does the second phrase mean? I tell you, he shouldn't go and explain the mitzvahs to others, and he himself doesn't do that. That is not proper. But first, the person should do what he has learned, and then he teaches it to others. As our sages of blessed memory have said, knowing the Devarim, it is pleasant things, that comes out from the mouth of those that you got to do what you should say. All right, now let's go further. Now the third phrase that he says, anybody is the important thing but the action. And before you don't do it yourself. You should do it yourself and then you go and teach others. Okay. Now the third phrase.
Yeah.
Now, if it says all that add to your words brings a sin, you would imagine that this is a repetition of the first phrase. I didn't find anything greater than... But he says, no, that's not so. He says, this is the way it's supposed to be explained. Zerwinian, when it says if you add to your words, it will bring a sin, it's talking about words. A person, when he's deciding halacha, is not supposed to go and talk too much when he makes a decision. Or he shouldn't talk too swiftly or too fast. When a question comes before a row, he's not just to analyze it and think maybe there's something hidden here before he makes a decision. He first should wait a little while. Choshav and think Yomer what he should say. The Mishko, and the words should be weighed in his mind before it comes out of his mouth. Lo Yomayer also, and he shouldn't swiftly say them. Because when a person speaks too much words, Lo Yaktal Pesha, he will not avoid sinning.
This is what I don't understand.
And he will think, that the matter is the way he says it is. A law that's
I'm in love with his words,
Yes.
his decision, his ability
Yeah,
to
sounds
be,
Yeah.
use good language or
Yeah,
something.
that's right.
So that's a sin, that
He should not-
falls in love with him.
Self-aggrandizing his own capacity to analyze it and therefore come to a conclusion that may be erroneous. And he can bring sinning with his decision, because the decision may be incorrect. Okay, therefore, the important part is not the learning, it's the actual action that comes out of the learning. This is talking about the subject matter of the Torah. To let us know. It's talking about words of Torah. You got to be very careful about that. It's not something that you can just go and big D and as Gay said, out comes those. You're not supposed to explain this as talking about not speaking a lot of words, a lot of boring shall hold. It's not talking, because if it's talking about just not speaking a lot of words of coal, it wouldn't have placed it at this position in the Canaan. If it was talking about words of coal, they would have had to say it on the first, next to the first phrase.
Yeah.
Equal. You say it like this: I didn't find better to a body than to keep quiet.
Yeah.
And anybody that speaks too much is making a sin.
Yeah.
And then the third phrase, not the learning is the most important time, but the person says you're not supposed to, I never found anything better than silence. And then it interposes the fact that you're learning. It interposes about the fact you're learning. Then the third phrase is talking about your learning. When you're learning and you're making it your ma'aseh, the learning must be learned to the point that you've got a proper decision in relation to what you're supposed to be doing. Because unfortunately, a lot of times you can make mistakes in this area. When you do learn, you have to learn very carefully. And you cannot make decisions swiftly. I'll give you an example of that. My Rabbi David Kazanov once gave an example. He said, before you answer a question, if they come to you as a rabbi, and you have to, a rabbi is basically supposed to be a person that is a judge on questions of halacha, of Jewish law, of Torah law, and he's got to be able to go and decide what the decision should be according to the Torah law. Now that means, of course, that he has to have a capacity to learn the Talmud and to apply the codes based on the Talmud. he has no such capacity, he has no business deciding the question. It's a joke. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people that call themselves rabbis that are not that, they don't have that capacity, and it's a joke. The whole thing is a joke. It wouldn't be so tragic. Because, all right, when you decide such a question, you've got to be very careful. He says, don't try to answer a question until you understand what the question is. So he gave an example. He says, there once was a man that came to another town, and he knew there was a gentleman that was a sheikh, a ritual slaughterer. He knew that last time he came to that town a few months before, the man had been a ritual slaughterer, and, well, could still be there, not often like this. On the holiday, the mitzvah to chef the chicken, you need a chicken to have a meal, and Yom Tov itself, and prepare it and cook it for Yom Tov. You understand? It's permissible. Stay on pace. You understand? Yeah. So that's our law. There's no question about it. So he came to this man that he knew was sheikh. He had a couple of chickens, and he was visiting this town. He says, would you chef these chickens for me? And the man says, if the rabbi of our town says I can chef them for you, I'll be glad to chef them for you. So he came to the town, he came to the rabbi of the town, he said, is it permissible just on Yom Tov? But that wasn't the real question.
The real question is...
So the rabbi was up to the thing, so he asked the question, who asked you to ask me this question? Because ordinarily, would it be such a simple thing? Would you have to ask a rabbi for it? Just look at the Shulchan Aruch there, this thing right in front of you. You don't have to be a big Thomas Hoffman to figure it out. But there it is, permissible. So the rabbi didn't say it's permissible. He said, I asked you to ask this question. He investigated. He said, I asked him there, and he said, if you say he can chef, he will chef today. So the rabbi says, oh, see, this particular man had been prohibited from continuing shechita because we found something wrong with his actions, and he was no longer considered kosher to be a sheikh. So since the rabbi of the town has prohibited him, now if the rabbi in the town now permits him, he's again permitted to shecht again. You understand? So it wasn't a hasty answer to say you know what it's all about, because ordinarily the question implies, but the truth is, in relation to that particular man, the answer should be no, even though ordinarily for a regular shochet it would be. And the same thing there's hidden in every question, sometimes in the first conversation. And therefore, when it says, you be very careful what you talk about. Sometimes you might get so blown up with your own idea of your grandioseness and your Torah knowledge, you can go and make a mistake because of you talking too much. Because we worry that perhaps that blood is regular blood, and we don't eat the blood. Again, but we don't make a differentiation. Sometimes it's blood from the chicken itself. Well, whatever it is, we all have our deficiencies. Welcome to the club. Now, what's the problem now? If you're not worried, then you really have nothing to worry about. You see, you're going, nothing to worry about. You see, the person that worries is the one that's going to go through thick sand, and nobody gets a free ride. If you want to go become a tzaddik, a righteous type, God will help you. But it's going to be a long struggle. It's not going to be easy. Understand? You got to work at it. But everybody's got to do the same thing. It's not just one person. Everybody has to learn and to go and do the mitzvahs the way they're supposed to be done. So it depends when you start. If you start now, it's all right. Maybe it would have been better if you started 5 or 10 years ago, but you didn't. So you start when you did start. Best, and to make up for lost time. And there's nothing to be upset about. Thanks God you're now becoming knowledgeable. And thanks God you're now understanding it's not so simplistic. You can't go and avoid the responsibilities that God has placed upon us. It's not easy to be responsible, but it's certainly better than being irresponsible. Oh, there's many things. Many things indeed. Many things. You bring me Gemara Sanhedrin. I'll give you a few examples of this just for a couple of minutes. Listen, there's many things, but I'll give you a few things. I'll read you a Mishnah in Sanhedrin. Jews have a portion in the world to come. Good? You understand that? Yeah. And unless you mess yourself up, you've got a portion in the world to come. Yeah. All you have to do is not mess yourself up. On a collective basis, every Jew is entitled to a portion of the world to come, even before he individually has. Just doesn't have to mess himself up. Go in order to get a portion of the world to come. In our case, we got two chances. We got a collective entry, and we got individual. The planting of the oil.
It comes from Isaiah.
Right.
Comes from Isaiah.
Right. Some of those don't have a portion of the world to come. Abraham and Faithful, my boy, there are some that don't have a portion of the world to come. Omer, a person that says, listen, you're listening to Choyal. There's no such thing as a concept of a resurrection from the Torah. If a person says that, he loses fast.
What do you mean?
That there is a foresight that God will eventually resurrect the dead of those that died. If he denies this concept, the Gemara goes to say, opposition in what he did. He doesn't believe it in Tfiyat says. He says there is none. Who tells him to open up his big mouth and talk? Number two. A person says there's Torah for him at Tony. And the Kiva says even those that read in books, the outside books, talk about books that lead you away from Torah and mitzvahs. And a person that uses sorcery. He whispers on a wound, something called any disease I placed in Egypt because I'm Lord your God. You're not supposed to act like a sorcerer. And then it goes, Abishol says the person pronounces the name of God, Shem Maforish, in the improper way. You're supposed to say Adonai, not the way it's printed. You understand that? And then it goes on to say, there were 3 kings, AVOS and 4 ordinary people. They don't have a portion of the world to come. Everybody else got one, but they managed to do it bad enough. Those from 3 of the Jewish kings. Rabbi ben Nabot was the one that divided the kingdom between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Was the son of the daughter of Yeshaya the prophet. And when he got older, he murdered his grandfather. Menashe did have a portion of the world to come. So then he's followed after 55 years of ruling in the country. He probably prayed to God, Ishmata, choose them to his kingdom, somewhat. Akuso Yeshiva, I only return him to his kingdom, below the Chaylam Abo Yeshiva, but didn't return him to his thing. Abo Adiotos, there were 4 ordinary types that lost, and Bilam was one of them, and the 2 enemies of David HaMelech and Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. All right. Why do they lose their portion of the world? We learned a person denies resurrection of the dead, therefore God won't give him. All the standards of God, midah k'neged midah. He rewards or punishes a person according to the way the person acts in this world. But this is just a few. There are many other things that go on to say. We'd have to spend more time on it if you want to go more.
The Meyamlo is on Perek Rishon, and the sentence 17 states the following. His son Shimon said, all my life I have grown up among the sages, and I have not found anything better for the body than silence. The main thing is not study, but practice. Whoever speaks excessively brings about sin. This Shimon was the son of Rabbi Gamliel, mentioned in the previous Mishnah. He was the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was one of the 10 martyrs killed by the Romans, which is mentioned in the Kinos of Tisha B'Av. Here he is merely referred to as Shimon, and not as Rabban Shimon. This is because when he made this statement, he was not yet president, or Nasi. His father lived for many years, and only after his father's death did he become the president of the Sanhedrin. This master teaches us an enlightened doctrine in every one of his sayings. When he says, all my life I grew up among the sages, he is teaching us a lesson regarding the trait of humility, anava. He said, all my days, even after I became president of the Sanhedrin and leader of all Israel, I never acted like an important person. I always comported myself like a minor figure among the great. Although I was a leader and my colleagues were subservient to me, I always honored them as if they were the leaders and I was the one who was subservient to them. This is a very important lesson in leadership. Although a person rises to high position and becomes a leader of Israel, he should still act and behave with much humility, and not assert his authority over the people. He continues, I have not found anything better for the body than silence. With matters that relate to the body and not the soul, there is nothing better than to keep quiet and say as little as possible. Excessive talk leads one to sin. However, in speech that relates to the soul, such as Torah study or prayer and discussions of the commandments, silence is no virtue. In such areas, speech is a virtue. Moshe Maimonides says that the sign of a wise man who is in control of his intellect is minimal speech. Excessive speech is a sign of mental disturbance. He relates that there was once a sage who was always very quiet, speaking only when absolutely necessary. When asked the reason for his reticence, the sage replied, human speech can be divided into 4 categories. The first category is entirely evil and dangerous. The second is good on one hand, but bad on the other. The third is neither good nor bad. And the fourth is entirely good. The first category, which is all bad, includes malicious speech, lashon hara, against one's fellow man, cursing and insulting others, profanity, it's nivlos hapeh, and speaking in the synagogue. The second category, which is good on one hand and bad on the other, consists of publicly praising a person and speaking of his good deeds. There is some benefit from this, but there can always be enemies of this person among the listeners. When the enemy hears this person being praised, he may be incited to even greater hatred, and evil may ensue. The third category, which is neither good nor bad, is the idle discussion of current happenings, such as wars and construction of buildings. People stand around and discuss how one king made war on another, and how such a person built such an edifice. While such chatter is not harmful, neither is it beneficial. The fourth category, which is entirely good, consists of discussions of Torah topics and the observance of commandments, prayer, and discussion of how to acquire good traits and avoid bad ones. The sage concluded, and since of the 4 types of conversations in the world, 2 are dangerous and a third is useless, when I hear such conversations, I remain silent. I know for certain that no good will come from them. It is only when I hear the 4th type of conversation that I participate. That is why I am usually silent. Of the 4 categories of human conversation, I avoid 3. Rabbi Moshe Maimonides divides speech into 5 categories. The virtuous, that's mitzvah, the forbidden, nizkar, the loathsome, nimas, the desirable, and the permissible, mutter, which is neither virtuous nor forbidden. Virtuous speech consists of discussions of Torah, prayer, and commandments. Forbidden speech consists of lies, malicious gossip, false testimony, profanity, and cursing or insulting one's fellow man. All this is forbidden by the Torah. The third category, which is loathsome, includes idle discussion of current happenings, such as wars and political intrigues between kings or nations. God abhors such speech because, instead of wasting time in such idle conversation, one should use the time to study Torah. Our sages called such idle conversation sichos betala. Many sages were praised by the Talmud merely because all their lives they never engaged in such idle conversation. The 4th type of speech, which is considered desirable, consists of discussions bordering on good personality traits, how to improve one's ways and how to avoid bad traits, and the company of the wicked. As a result of such conversation, people are able to avoid bad personality traits and crooked paths, and develop good traits, thus walking in the path of righteousness. Since such conversation causes a person to be loved by God, it is called loved or desirable speech. The fifth category, which is considered permissible, involves speech necessary for one's personal life, such as his business and livelihood. It is called permissible since a person is allowed to speak about it when necessary, and it is neither loathsome nor desirable. It is with regard to this fifth category of speech that our sages have taught that silence is good. Here, one must be very careful of what he says. With regard to the categories of forbidden and loathsome speech, the sages did not have to tell us that silence is good, since one understands that such speech must be avoided totally. The admonition also did not apply to the virtuous and desirable categories of speech, since one gains merit for it. But when engaging in these categories of speech, one must also carry out what he says. He should not preach one thing to the public and do the opposite himself. The master thus adds, the main thing is not preaching, but practice. When you preach to the public and admonish them, that is not the main thing. You must also practice what you preach. When a person admonishes others and preaches in excess of what he himself does, he is committing a sin and subjecting himself to the usual criticism that he should correct himself before correcting others. Some commentaries state that when the master says, I have not found anything as good as for the body as silence, he was speaking about answering one who has dishonored or mistreated him. The best advice is to remain silent and not reply. One of the sages thus gave his son the following general advice. If you cannot bear to hear one word of insult, you will end up hearing many more words of insult. But if you remain silent to the insult, you will also silence the one who is bent on insulting you. If you wish to avenge an evil act, there is no better vengeance than remaining silent and not replying. The Talmud speaks of the person who remains silent and does not reply to an insult, not out of fear, but because of respect for God. Such a person considers the insult or dishonor as suffering which will atone for his sins. Kaporos avonos. The Talmud states that regarding such a person it is written in Judges, those who love God shall be like the sun when it goes forth in strength. This Talmudical statement can be understood in terms of the teaching that when they were first created, the moon quarreled with the sun and complained to God that it is not possible for two kings to wear the same crown. The moon claimed that it had sufficient light to illuminate the world, and there was no need for the sun. The result, however, was that God became angry with the moon, and he reduced its size. Since the sun remained silent, God made it even greater than it was originally. Similarly, God reduces the person who dishonors and mistreats others. But when the other listens to his insults in silence, he is elevated to heights of greatness. Because of this, the Master said, I have not found anything better for the body than silence. He is saying that even when one is insulted, there is no better response than to remain silent. As additional proof as to the value of silence, the Master continues by saying, the main thing is not study, but action. When a person studies the Torah, he has merit for his studies only if he lives by them. If he practices what he studies, then the study itself is considered a virtue. But if a person does not practice what he studies, then he would have been better off if he had remained silent. The reason for this is because a Torah scholar is judged more harshly if he does wrong than if he is an ignoramus. Unless one intends to keep what he learns, it is better to remain silent and not study. The Master concludes that it is therefore certainly best to remain silent in mundane matters, since one who talks excessively brings himself to sin. Although God had commanded Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of knowledge, he had not forbidden them to touch it. But when asked by the serpent, Eve answered, God said, do not eat from it, and do not touch it, lest you die. In Bereshit, chapter 3, sentence 3. The serpent then pushed Eve against the tree, making her touch it. He then said to her, you touched the tree and you did not die. Just as you did not die when you touched the tree, you will not die if you eat its fruit. It was in this manner that he induced her to eat from the tree of knowledge, bringing such disaster to the world. We thus see that excessive speech was the cause of even the first sin. If Eve had not said more than she had to, the serpent would never have been able to bring her to sin. In this week's Sedra, Parshas Balak, we find the sentence, chapter 23, verse 21, Lo hibit avein b'Yaakov. He sees no iniquity in Yaakov. The story is told about Reb Zuzha of Hanapoli, who was once present in the home of his Rabbi, the Maggid of Mezrich, when a man entered and proceeded to recite a great list of his requests. With the penetrating perception which accompanies the divine gift of Ruach HaKodesh, Reb Zuzha saw that this man's sins were very grave indeed. He was quite indignant. How dare the man stand so fearless and unpenitent before the holy Rav Dovber of Mizrich? He shouted, a man who has committed such and such, is such a man not ashamed to stand there before the tzaddik without at least a glimmer of tshuva? After the man had left, Zuzha expressed his profound regret at having spoken in this way in the presence of his Rabbi, whereupon the Maggid gave him his blessing that from that day on he would never see evil in a fellow Jew, only good. And thus he was able to fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment, he sees no iniquity in Yaakov. We also find in the Sedra, chapter 24, sentence 17, I see it, but not now. The story is told that after the passing of the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Zalman of Ladi, that his grandson, Reb Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, happened to be in a town for a wedding. There he overheard a few Hasidim in the next room lamenting about the state of the world as it now was left in. God alone knew when the Messiah would finally come. So he opened the door and said, but this is what the Gentile prophet Bilam said concerning the Messianic redemption. He stated, Erenu velo ata. I see it, but not now. I behold it, but it is not near. We Jews, though, should hope and look forward to the coming of the Mashiach every day. And in this connection, I heard from my grandfather that his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, had the ability to cause even a day-old child to experience the loftiest levels of the awe of God. That's Yiras Hashem. His Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, could have fired even an inanimate object, such as a stone, with the same feeling. Why did they not do this? And thereby, since the whole creation would then be fired by an awareness of the divine presence, cause the Mashiach to come at once? The answer is that God did not yet will it. And if the arrival of the Mashiach depends on the divine will, then how is this position altered by the passing of our Rebbe, my grandfather? When the proper time comes, and God so wills it, the Mashiach will surely appear.
Yeah, Shimon ben Omer. You have it? He says three things in this Mishnah. all my days I have grown up among the sages, people, and I found nothing better for a person's body than silence. Learning is not the most important thing, it's the actual action. That's the second statement he said. Hey, everybody that speaks a lot of words and adds to the words, he brings sin upon himself.
I don't understand that.
Well, now, you recall we had it in regards to what a person is permitted to talk about the different sheetahs that the Advarim shall have things of their nature on Shabbos. Right. Now, this is Rambam is first going to go and say something about a person that was made sort of what in his own mind, the various areas of speech. And he analyzed which areas are beneficial and which areas are to be avoided. And so therefore, any areas that were to be avoided, he minimizes to the absolute minimum. So that he should avoid any speech that was anything that was not for him. You understand? After the Rambam will enumerate this person, then he will analyze it in the light of the Torah, and he will set different standards as to what a person should do in relation to types of impermissible type of speech. You understand the concept? After we go over the Rambam concisely and to the point. Okay? You understand? I'm just telling you ahead of time. Yud Zayin. Now I'm going to read it as though it's written in English. Of course, you know Hebrew, and I'm going to try to translate as best I can the words as we go along, Hebrew and Aramaic. The sages already said, when a person says a lot of words, you will not stop from doing something that is improper. Because of a lot of words, you have a lot of words more than necessary, as I will explain now, because when a person says a lot of words, eventually he will sin. So it's impossible for him that he will not say something that he shouldn't say. It's not, because if you talk long enough, you're going to say things. And we know one of the characteristics of the sages are that they were very circumspect in their speech. And one of the characteristics of fools are that they speak a lot. As we said, of the fool is when he speaks a lot of words. And already our sages said that a person that minimizes the amount of words that he speaks is a proof that he has come to a high station of elevation. And we have learned that a person is considered a person that has good genealogical background. Those that were the most pure among the Babylonian Jews were the ones who are keeping quiet. Genealogical purity among Jews is that they are very sparse in their speech. And we said in the book of Standards, one of these sages appeared to be very quiet, and he would not speak very much, and it was that anything that was not permitted or fit to be said. And we only speak very little indeed. And they asked this sage, why is he so quiet? He speaks so much. And he said, I have investigated all the speech that I have seen, and it could be divided into 4 categories. The first category, you have the Chilek Rishon, you see where I'm at, the big print? The first category is completely damaging without any redeeming features whatsoever. Like, for instance, thinking of people and speaking words of worthless words and things of that nature, that's a complete foolishness. So that part is certainly something to be avoided. And then the second portion, that on one side it causes a person damage, and the other side it has some beneficial thing. From one side it doesn't help too much, and it doesn't hurt too much, like most of the words of people that talk. So it's sort of small talk. It really doesn't do much of good one way or the other. Yeah, they talk about how was this wall built, and have you seen how this particular building was built, and they talk about the days, the events of the day, and most of the various things of the mundane things about this person and this person, things that really don't have any real lasting benefit, don't hurt too many people as long as the person knows what he's saying, but if you're not doing much of good anything. These are the words of the ordinary person. Also, too much help for that. So that's the first question. Well, the second one, please. Well, 1 minute. Wait. Oh, wait. Wait. I'm sorry. I must have skipped a line here. There's a second classification is it has a damage on one side, it has a good side on the other part. That's a crazy thing, but then he can cause his enemies to hate him and cause the man damages if he goes and praises them. And so that way it is also something that perhaps should be avoided too. Begins off by the law.
So there's
nothing to
no
get
improvement.
And the third thing is what I was telling you about the things that doesn't have any help, or the neutral small talk, people talk and they spend all their time talking about it. And this is and then the first thing is words. The fourth thing is things that are completely good for a person, like words of Torah wisdom and various, and what a person's life is dependent upon. And these words, this is the area. And he says, I investigated all these areas. Yeah. He says, I investigated all these areas, and if I find they're one of the first, if they're from the fourth type, I speak about it. And if they're not from the other three, I keep quiet about it. In other words, he's eliminated 3/4 of the conversation that he would analyze it. I'm a meritorious type. And this way he investigated, and that way he is lacking 3/4 of anything he could say. And I say, Rambam says after he says this person that did this thing, he says, I say it really should be divided in 4 portions, or 5 portions. And 5 portions. The first thing is the mitzvah. Second thing, a person should be very careful from it, doing it. The third thing, it's abhorrent to such conversation. The fourth thing, it's lovable, something that's proper. And the fifth thing, it's permissible. Yeah. All right, now let's start with the first thing. Now this Rambam says these are the areas how you analyze it. The first thing is the mitzvahs, reading the Torah, learning it, and to learn the Talmud. All this is a great mitzvah to do it. The person is obligated to do it. You have to speak about the Torah. And it is equal in merit to all the other mitzvahs, and we already said a person that the person should emphasize this as much as possible. We haven't come to this yet. So on the second section is things that are prohibited to be doing. A person is obligated to avoid doing, like false testimony and speaking false things and being a gossip and cursing and the words of the Torah to teach us on all these things, and also any kinds of improper conversation, lashon hara, everything like that. You got to be avoiding that. But the third portion is things that are neas, abhorrent, that don't have any help to a person. It's vera, but it's very stuff that people talk all the time, small talk. And they talk about gossiping about what's happening with the king or what he's doing in his palace. And you hear this guy died, this person died. And our sages call these words sicha b'tachon, idle talk. And the Chassidim, they tried to go and leave this alone. And he would never speak. And they talk about one Rabbi that never would speak Tehillah in his entire life. And from this portion also it is proper that a person should guide himself against doing it, because it would at least something. Then the fourth portion, it is what is lovable, that thing there that you try to emphasize the good qualities that a person should try to aspire to, and to emphasize the bad qualities of the improper types of conduct that a person should go away from. Yeah, a musar of that nature, and to praise things that are important, and to teach the good standards. And and the bad standards a person must avoid at all times, and go away from it. And you learn the various standards and everything, and this is called Derech Eretz, according to the Rambam. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Now, the fifth thing, according to Rambam, is something that's permissible. It's the word that a person has to do to make a living. He's got to go on in his business dealings and making parnosa, and in his food and his conversation when he has to eat and drink and everything. And yes, it's permissible. Yeah, no. It is not, doesn't lead to a love, a better standard, a spoil.
Yeah.
You understanding?
Yeah.
All right. And it's not abhorrent, but if he wishes to talk about it, he may, and if he wishes, he doesn't. And this fifth standard, it's better that a person should diminish the conversation he has in the permissible standard. And he should, and people are admonished to avoid this as much as possible. But the parts that are prohibited and the parts that are abhorrent, without any question, you don't have to warn people about it. You don't have, because there's no question about it, that you must avoid them on their own. You have to keep them, not talk about them at all. Well, that's what he's trying to say. The mitzvah, the part that's a mitzvah, the problem of learning Torah and talking about mitzvahs, or the parts that has to do with love of building up a higher standards of conduct and avoiding improper standards of conduct, what Rambam calls Derech Eretz. These are to be emphasized. The person can be thinking that all the time, and it's good for him to do so. But he has to be careful in two areas. First, he has to go and let his actions coincide to his words. It's not enough of a person to talk a good thing about the Torah. It's towards the words that come from a person that doesn't. Of course, my reading. And on this subject matter, he says, not the learning is the important part, but the action. In other words, up to now we're talking about you're supposed to diminish the amount of words you talk. But when it comes to the final thing is, you must understand, even if you have managed to understand what you're supposed to say and what you're supposed to avoid saying, your actions have to go and reflect what you've been saying. That says to a tzaddik that he should learn these high steps. And he says you should learn it, and you should do it. You should do it then. The second matter is that you have to diminish the amount in saying, when you speak to your students, you're not supposed to speak in anything but don't confuse them. Because unfortunately, when a person is beginning to learn Torah, if you speak too much, that they lose the point. And that's why it's so beautiful to learn. And he says also here, it says that you have to investigate the subject matter, if it's going in a proper way or not. And certainly I verified all this thing, even though it is something that people that are Torah knowledgeable, they usually do these. He says, because I've seen men that are knowledgeable in Torah, sometimes when they have too much to drink, kupra, something other celebration of that nature. Some people consider it, I don't know, whatever it is. And you have to be very careful to avoid when you're under the influence, and you must say it in such a way you're not supposed to make the Torah. You're sharing something that is less than. And sometimes the people say words that's not permitted to that area. They have to be very careful what they're saying. I don't want to go without here. I want to go. He goes on later on. He goes on to say, he talks about you can come to Lashon Hara, and you have to be very careful about what you're doing. And he goes on later to say that there are many things that we've learned. Turn to page 12. That's about 6-7 lines from the top. On three things a person is punished in this world. He has no portion in the world to come. AVOS the following, if he worships idols, that means he doesn't do tshuva. Gili arises and he has committed improper sexual activity. He has engaged in murders. On top. I skip all of them there. A person is paid for in this world. And he doesn't get a portion of the world. He worships idols. And Gili arises if he committed improper sexual activity. He has engaged in murder. The Lashon Hara connected to Kulam. Hara is equal to all of them put together. Right. And the Gemara says, it says there by Moshe Rabbeinu said that people have sinned. A great fet, Gila is great evil. When we're talking about Gila Arias, is equal against all three of those great events, is equal in severity to all three of the big cardinal. The Gemara is sometimes somewhat of a theme. After the first one, after that, trials and tribulations.
Yeah.
Then
We allow them to enter, or that is to...
about what you want to do. Whatever has to be done has to be done.
It can be righted once he gets married, that he has a mate.
No.
Yeah.
You're drawing on this page.
If you do tshuva in this world, you won't have...
All right, everybody's got different problems. No, Mayor.
I have a spot. I can't give him an answer on the
You
spot.
things that have to be done. First of all, a person has to understand that he did something that's against the will of God. Then the person has to go before God.
Thanks only in the framework of a marriage, and in no other way except because I'm trying to explain that there's anything other than that is not.
Remember there was after Bill next week. There was some there that Zimri lived with the daughter. He lived with her and permitted such a woman unless she is his wife. Any other woman he is not permitted.
Now there's a reason for this.
The whole period.
And you don't make that.
Not only dipping certain rules that have to be followed. You have the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to. Let's go further now. And
I understand what this and I know the remedy for it. Aside from marriage, there's another remedy.
not that drastic.
If you spend hours a day in learning, you will be able to drive away the sex which everyone has unless they spend time in contemplating.
If you're a passionate nature of marriage, you should get married. Very in nature that you should first learn Torah, then get there. But in either case, you have the obligation to learn Torah as well as getting married. Which comes first?
The menstruator.
Not at all. Only in the sense that you are not permitted to touch them. It doesn't mean that well, whatever it is, the fact is that there's a lot of things to learn, and the Torah is tremendous. It's like an ocean. And you shouldn't be upset if you come to certain areas until you come knowledgeable. I assure you that Judaism is a living religion. It has been lived with and lived thousands of years. And it's not impossible to live under the law, and it shouldn't be construed as such. It only appears impossible to someone that is not knowledgeable and he assumes that he's a tremendous burden. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is that the Torah is a protection in many areas, whereas if you wouldn't take that protection. For instance, many people would imagine that being a Shomer Shabbos, observing the Shabbos, is a tremendous impediment to their being. The truth is, nothing could be further from the truth. No way in the world that we can go and function if we didn't have one day in the week when we can go and to those that really practice marriage, it is not a burden at all. They look forward to it with a great enthusiasm. So a person that observes purity of family relationships is a very happy person. Both a man and the wife. They're both very happy. So if this leads to personal happiness, it is not something to be done. I can't understand it. How can it be? It can't be as long as you're on the outside looking in. If you come in, you'll find out that Baruch Hashem, it is a tremendous thing. A person is not boxed out of living. You have a much more fruitful existence, and everything, every area. For instance, if you have kashrus, people will say, how can you live when you only eat certain foods? You can't eat everything else. I assure you that there are many good reasons why kashrus is a wonderful thing for a person. Again, unless a person observes it and lives according to it, he assumes that it's some kind of impossible burden. Everything is possible. Not only possible, it's a very wonderful way of living. A person has a feeling of satisfaction, a feeling of happiness, that you would never have if you didn't go in these areas. And the only thing I can tell you is from personal experience. And the only way you can possibly really understand it is to live it. Once you live it, you'll understand very wonderful areas, and not to be avoided in any way, and not to be looked down upon. Because I assure you, everything that was set up by Almighty God, and He knows better than we do And I assure you, the Rabbi Shem and his wisdom understand that certain areas in which we have to go and do a certain way, but his word for it that it's much better than what we can imagine. It's unfortunate that so many people are so ignorant of the Torah knowledge that they assume that it's some kind of old-fashioned, irrelevant, and not any relevance to our present day. Nothing can be further from the truth. Mishnah, Yud Zayin, and Turkey, all those, we're now going to learn the Rabbeinu Yud.
A lot of really known about it is
anything the person is not acquainted with is different. All right, let's go further. Shimon below, you have it? No, below Yud Zayin, you have it? Yeah. Shimon below, Shimon his son, Omer, Kol Yavim Akomim, all my days I have grown up among the sages, and I have seen Nasi, and I have understood all the most important standards. And I did not find the gufto to my body better than silence. Already explained the Indian Ashtiko in relation to the subject matter of silence. In an area where there will be a damage to a person on any side, or there's only damage on one side, but there's a reward, some kind of a profit on the other side. Yeah. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel doesn't have to warn us against these areas. If you can lose out, even totally, it's better to avoid speaking in these areas. I know every person would be careful about these areas. In Torah, if he wants to protect himself from trouble. Who needs trouble? And a person that has any kind of understanding will avoid these areas. Well, even in the areas in which a person has no damage whatsoever. Everything in this area is profitable. To me, daily activity of a serf, what he needs for his own bodily needs to make a living. And it still should be minimize his conversation in these areas. And he should not go and increase in the conversation in these areas. Today's only as much as necessary. The Dover is still hevel, and certainly doesn't have to talk about in areas of just hevel, the word for that. One way we can go up or down. A person must not enter in that kind of conversation at all. Whereas and this we also say in the Yerushalmi, quoting Yerushalmi. Ilu Havino, the Torah, the Sinai. If I had been at Mount Sinai, physically, Sinai, if I had been in Mount Sinai, so Ina trade us each one of us 2 mouths. Now we only have 1 mouth. Word. Oh, beautiful. Messing up and saying bad. No, he would have. He might have said it, but then he was thinking about it. He figured out that maybe it was better that God.
Yeah. It has a mark about it.
Yeah.
So his father told him, that is why you have 2 eyes. There are things that one should look at with his right eye. And there are other things that one should look at with the left eye. A fellow Jew is one that you should always look at with your right eye, to consider him in favor. However, a piece of candy, a toy, or some pleasure, this should be looked at with one's left eye. And that is why, from that time on, the previous Rabbi said that it became a principle in his life, deeply rooted in his heart, that one must always look at any Jew, whoever he may be, and in whatever spiritual state he finds them in, he must be looked at with a kindly eye.
You know there are 3 areas in which a Jew can operate. In a Maita, Dibur, and Machshava. Action. Dibur, speech. We're talking about speech. And we're going to have shiurim on Machshava. We're going to have a shiur because there's a shaila. There's a shaila that Moshe asked. He asked us some time ago where we learned about the gospel to think about Dibur and Makom Tumah.